So I knew this morning that getting started would be the most difficult part. I talked to Tony. He said getting started would be the most difficult part. Get your legs underneath you, just get going. And I really didn't know how to do that. So I guess maybe that's kind of what I'm doing here now, is just getting started. So on our way in this morning, Beth Ann asked me, she said, "Are you nervous?" And the answer to that question is yes, I am nervous, but I'm also excited. Tony mentioned that I got to talk to the youth back in February. They were doing a series over apologetics, and so I got to talk about science and creation and just kind of what I felt we should get out of that. It's something I've been interested in for a long time, but I'd never really sat down and put everything that I had thought about and wondered and gathered about that topic into one place, just because there's a lot. And so when Tony talked about this sermon series, and he said, "I want you to do something on science and creation, and let's do it for adults," I was very excited. And so we'll see where we go this morning, and hopefully you can get something out of it. My kids would tell you that I am often guilty of taking a really long time to get to the point. So fair warning to get to the point that I want to make today about what we should take away from the story of creation. We're going to talk about some stuff that may not immediately seem relevant or pertinent. But it's fun stuff. You may not believe me. You may say, "He's going to talk about science. I'm asleep already." I encourage you, don't do like the students that I teach at Walter State and tune me out. Hang with me for just a little while. It's fun stuff. It's stuff that I enjoy. Hopefully, it's going to be some stuff that makes you scratch your head and rub your chin a little bit and think, "I've never really thought about it that way before." But what makes this special for me is a lot of what I'm going to share, at least in the beginning, and we're not going to be very scripture heavy in the beginning, but we will get to that towards the end. A lot of what I'm going to share at the beginning is part of my personal story, and I'm going to try to use that to get us to the main point and what I believe we should get out of creation. So hang with me for just a little bit if you can. One other thing before we start, Tony mentioned I'm a professor at Walter State. I'm used to speaking for 90 minutes at a time. I don't plan to do that. I've got the clock going back there. I've got a section up here that will probably keep me on track. There's a chance that I'm going to blaze through this and you will actually be one of the first ones in line at Elsa's on. But I promise not to go 90 minutes, right? So in April of this year, humans did something incredible. Humans went to the moon for the first time in 53 years. And in an interview, whenever he got back from the mission, the commander of the Artemis II, his name is Reed Weissman, he gave an interview and he opened with that by saying, "I'm not a very religious person. But whenever we got back onto that ship, onto that aircraft carrier after they picked us up out of the ocean," he said, "I immediately had to find a chaplain. Whenever I found the chaplain and I saw the cross, I broke down in tears." And he accounted that the reason he felt that way is as they rounded the moon, came around from the dark side of the moon, the earth, suspended in the blackness of space, came into view. And he said, it was otherworldly. It was amazing. It was unlike anything I have ever seen before. And he said, "I really don't think humanity has evolved to the point where we can comprehend what I saw." I've never been to space. I've never circled the moon. If NASA called and said, "We've got a seat for you on the next rocket launch," I would be down there in a heartbeat. I would love to do something like that. But I never have. In all honesty, probably never will, and that's okay. But years ago, we were privileged to take a trip to Hawaii. Beth Ann's dad had a medical convention there, and so they were gracious enough to take our entire family. One day, while he was in meetings, we all went exploring. We did some of the traditional waterfall hikes. We visited some of the other sites and cities, but the last place we visited was a place called Laupahoehoe. This place once thrived as a fishing village, and it was untouched by missionaries and by plantation life that was taken over the island. But in the late 1800s, one of the sugar plantations finally made its way here, and it developed into a very big and important port. However, in 1946, a lot of the area was destroyed by a tsunami. And so really what is left now is just a beach and a small area for the locals to enjoy and camp and for tourists to go and visit. In order to get there, we navigated down a windy, mile-long road that was cut into the cliffs. And occasionally, we would round a corner and we would see something like this. You can see the cliffs in the background. If the image was, and you can see the ocean out there, and we gasped at how awesome it looked. But whenever we got down to the actual beach, we realized that the view from the top did not compare, right? The beach is lava rocks, and these lava rocks were huge. They jutted up from the ocean, and the giant waves crashed against them. The roar from the ocean and the wind was so loud, you couldn't hardly hear anything. And as I stood there on the beach, I felt this urge to climb out on the rocks and experience it even closer, right? And I did. I got out there and I felt the power of the ocean. It knocked me clean off of those rocks, right? But what was driving me was not adrenaline, and it wasn't a sense of adventure, right? It was awe. There was something special about what I saw. When we reflected on our time at the beach later, Beth Ann told me that she and her mother stood at the edge of the beach and started singing the old hymn, "How Great Thou Art." They had no desire to climb out on the rocks, but they felt that same awe and amazement that I felt. And so when we experience creation like this, it's something powerful and emotional, right? It strikes us all very deeply. For me, it also raised some challenging science-focused questions. A lot of how did all of this come to be? And so I thought about my journey, and back in college, I had a professor who introduced me to how science and faith can align. Two things always came up, and if I asked you to guess what those two things were, a lot of you would probably get them right, and you would say the Big Bang Theory and evolution. Those were always hot topic issues. They always seem to be at the forefront of whenever there's a debate between science and faith, right? It always seemed like believers would say that these two things were completely false and had no business being discussed, and non-believers said that they were absolute truth and everyone should just accept them for what they are. Right? That was a lot of he said, she said, and this is what we think, and I wasn't really okay with that. One day, I saw this cartoon, and I absolutely loved it. I felt like it really drove the point home for me, right? And so it's, do you believe in the Big Bang Theory? And yes, God spoke, and bang, there it was, right? So while the author intends this to be a joke, right, and maybe even using it to poke some fun at either believers or non-believers, depending upon where the author stands, I hope that this morning we might find that there could be a bit of truth tucked away in it somewhere. As a graduate student at UT, I had the opportunity to talk to prospective graduate students. We would host these big weekends. They would come in, they would tour the campus, they would tour the research labs, and we always tried to give them an idea of what life was going to be like on and around campus. And so UT had this daily newspaper called the Daily Beacon, and we would make sure that there were copies of it out for these students to look at. One time, this weekend happened to overlap with an event that was centered on intelligent design. Right? I distinctly remember that as we were preparing for that event, the organizer of it picked up one of those newspapers, and this was like front page, full front page article, come to our intelligent design conference. And he sarcastically said that, wow, this is a great time for an event like this to be going on, as we're bringing in all of these students that we want to attract to our campus. Someone mentioned that a group of UT scientists was planning to attend the event, and their mission was to educate these folks on what truth and science really was. One of my lab mates said, there's no way that anyone can be a legitimate scientist and believe the nonsense that's going to be presented at that conference. Well, I knew that I was a darn good scientist and a much better chemist than she was, but we won't go there, right? And even though I knew that I believed God to be the creator of everything, I didn't say anything at all, right? It felt so wrong not to say anything, but I had no idea how to debate them. It was like 8 against 1. That's not odds that I really felt comfortable getting into in the organic lab that I worked in. But that feeling stuck with me, and I wanted to learn more about what I believed and why I believed that. So I began to look at how I learn and how I interpret things. I'm a very analytical person. I take things literally, right? If you tell me this is what's going to happen, I'm going to believe that that is what is going to happen. I don't like to have to infer. I don't like to have to try to figure out what the author means. Just tell me what I need to know. That's why I studied chemistry and math and not folk literature, right? I have no desire to try to decipher the symbolisms and the metaphors that you want to put in your poems and in your stories. Tell me what I need to know. Let me read the book. Make a movie if you can. That would be a little bit better. But I want the data and I want the facts. And so as I read things, pamphlets or lectures, even the story in Genesis, right? As I listened to people talk, I took that information literally, right? I took their words for what they were saying. And if you read Genesis chapter 1 literally, word for word, everything is what it says, and you apply biblical timelines, right? You can argue that the creation happened 6,000 to 10,000 years ago. Right? This sets well with some folks, not so well with others, right? Some of you may be literal-minded people like me and say, well, there's really nothing to argue. Genesis says day. It means day. You know what day means. Right? But if we think about that, we've all had somebody tell us a story, and this person is usually older than us, and they start the story, well, back in my day. Right? So there's the word day, but it doesn't really mean the same day that we think it means then, right? My kids, whenever I ask them to do some chores around the house, they complain, God, Dad, that's going to take all day long. Well, no, it's not going to take all 24 hours to do it. You're going to put in just a little bit of work, and then it's going to be done, right? Whenever we go to Dollywood, right, we leave that event, and we think, I'm so glad today is over, right? But the day is not over, because you've still got to drive home, right? There's still hours left in that day. So there are lots of ways to use the word day. And I found that very confusing for me. Even if you looked at the etymology of those words and went back to the Hebrew and everything, it still didn't quite set like I wanted it to, right? And so for me, there was this push to get even deeper at the answers of how God created the universe. And so whether you believe Genesis 1:1 is meant to be taken literally or not, right? Whichever timeline you subscribe to, right? You're going to be forced to answer some challenging and interesting and thought-provoking questions, right? And so the first one that came to mind is, if the Earth is 6,000 to 10,000 years old, how do you explain things like radioisotope dating and geological features that say that caves like this begin to form 10 million years ago? Now, I'm not here to give you the answer on that. We can go have coffee and talk more about that if you want to, right? But that's not the point of today. Right? Another question that often comes up, how do you explain the dinosaurs? Are they in the Bible, right? I watched Jurassic Park. I'm fairly convinced that if Noah took 2 velociraptors onto that ark, nobody and nothing is getting off that boat, right? Everything's done right there, right? A creature like those dinosaurs, surely they deserve a mention in the Bible. I mean, we have Balaam and his talking donkey, right? That can go in, but velociraptors can't. I mean, let's explain that, right? It's got to be worth a mention in Scripture, right? And this is one of my favorites, right? This is a picture of the night sky, and circled in that dot is the Andromeda galaxy. It's the closest, largest galaxy to the Milky Way, right? And if we take some deep sky astrophotography and use a telescope, we can see that Andromeda really looks like this, right? And it's awe-inspiring and powerful, right? Our measurements of that light that we collect in our telescope and put through our computers tell us that the light coming from Andromeda, right, that Andromeda is 2.5 million light years away from us. Right? That's a long way. And if you think about what that means, right, a light year is the distance light travels in a year. So If you walk outside tonight and look up at the night sky and you see Andromeda, the light that you are seeing has been traveling for 2.5 million years. That means it's 2.5 million years old, right? According to what our science tells us. So there's a lot in these three things that I had trouble explaining, questions that I couldn't reconcile. And so I went looking, and it turns out there are lots of theories about how God created things, right? There's young earth creation, right? This says that Genesis account is accurate. Everything is 6,000 to 10,000 years old, and it argues that scientific data confirms this if you know how to look at it. Mature creation, right? This is an interesting one. Light was put into place, and things were created as to appear old, right? So the caves, they were created back in this young earth creation time frame, right? But they were just made to look old, right? The light coming from Andromeda really is that far away, but the light was put in place in transit. So it was kind of created as we would see it today. That's interesting. That raises a lot of questions. Is it deceptive to do that? And brings into some things about the nature of God. And again, we can talk more about that later, but that's not really the point. Some claim that scientific constants could change over time. That has lost a lot of its merit. We feel fairly confident that those constants are what they are. Right? And then there are some theories that claim that the conditions during this time were a lot different than what they are now. There was one theory that says there was an ice layer in the atmosphere, and it essentially created a hyperbaric chamber. And so the processes that we see here on Earth now are completely different than the processes then. And if you know anything about a hyperbaric chamber, it's oxygen rich, and so things can grow really big. Fruits, tomatoes, pumpkins, there are pictures of them just being ginormous. And the person that came up with this says that dinosaurs are in the Bible. They just lived in a hyperbaric chamber. They were just really big lizards. Right? Don't know. All right. But it's interesting. All right. It definitely makes me scratch my head, or scratch my chin. My head's up here, chin's down here. All right. Scratch either one. All right. Some ideas ditch the literal six-day creation and claim things like theistic evolution, right? The idea that everything was created through evolution, but God directed that process, all right? And then old earth creation, right? That God created everything without evolution because they don't like evolution or whatever, right? But the days in Genesis refer to ages or periods, right? These kept God in the equation, but fit better with the scientific idea that the earth is much, much older, right? So you can see in going through these, there are a lot of different ideas that are out there, right? Some of these seem crazy. Some of these made a little sense. But I wanted more than me saying, that's crazy, there's no way that happened, or I can buy that just a little bit, right? That was not the solid evidence that I wanted to rationalize how the universe did or did not come into existence. I didn't want to fall into the commonplace of letting my convictions about this topic that was so important to me to be based solely on my faith and someone else's interpretations. Right? But I had a problem. I'd become overwhelmed and confused. Each of those theories that were just up there could in part or in full answer some of the questions that I had mentioned, right? They could address the caves or the dinosaurs or the Andromeda galaxy being so far away. Right? Who had the correct answer, though? Right? Who really knew and who could prove it, right? Go back, I want the data, I want the facts. You can say this, but how can you prove it? I felt like all I had was the Bible says, and honestly, I wasn't entirely sure that I knew exactly what the Bible said when it came to this matter. Right? But other people were way more confident. Skeptics, atheists, people that I worked with on a daily basis, they were much more confident in what they were saying. Right? There was no hint of doubt when they answered questions, and they seemed to have answers for all of my questions. Right? Look how science disproves faith, and there's no room for the two of them to be in the same place. But finally, one day I felt like a light bulb went off. Right? I felt like I could make some headway in not proving or answering these questions, but in helping them to be reconciled with what I was wondering, what I was struggling with. Right? And it started with, what do they mean when they say faith? Right? Faith can certainly mean one's religious beliefs, but it can also mean a trust in something. Right? When I go rock climbing with the kids, I have to have a certain amount of trust or faith in that rope that it's going to do what it's supposed to do. Otherwise, I'm not going to go. Right? And I know from working in the lab for years and years and years that it takes a certain level of this type of faith or trust in order to do science. Right? Here's an example. If you go into my lab, there are two chemicals. One is called sodium hydroxide, one is called hydrochloric acid. If you take sodium hydroxide and use it by itself, you have a really strong base. It's what's in Drano. It's designed to break up grease and hair. That's why you pour it down your drain whenever you have a clog, right? It's really nasty. It's caustic. It burns your skin. It's just a nasty guy. Hydrochloric acid isn't much better. It sounds mean, right? It's found in certain types of cleaners. It produces this pungent odor. If you breathe it in, you can feel it burn your nose and your lungs. Right? Separately, both of them are nasty. But my chemistry textbook tells me that if I mix them together in equal parts, I get salt water. I cook my spaghetti in salt water, right? It's not dangerous, right? I can drink it if I want to. Now, have I ever gone into the lab and mixed together these two chemicals and tried to drink it, knowing that it is supposed to give me salt water? No, I haven't, right? Should you? Nope, don't recommend it, right? But do I believe it happens that way? Yes, I do. I can test it, right? I can measure the pH and see that the acid and the base have been neutralized. I can measure the salinity of it and see that salt is there. I can evaporate the water and see that I get essentially table salt, right? And I can test that and see that it matches what I buy at the grocery store. Even though I can't see the individual atoms, I can observe and draw some reasonable conclusions, and I can trust them. So if I believe that science has some merit and some validity and some reliability, has truth in what it's telling us, what does science tell us about the story of creation, and will it fit with Genesis? So this morning we're going to look very briefly at two areas of science that might help us in some way find God in his creation. And the first area is cosmology. Right? This is the study of the universe and where it came from. So this gets into a little bit of the thing that we talked about with the Andromeda Galaxy. One of the strongest arguments for the existence of a creator is known as the Kalam cosmological argument. And it begins with a simple principle, and it's one that should make sense to us. Whatever begins to exist has a cause. We never observe anything come into existence from nothing, right? A house, you had to have somebody build it. A painter a painting had an artist. A book had an author, right? So this argument first asks whether the universe has a beginning. And the Bible says it does. So then we ask the question, does modern science support that conclusion? And for centuries, many scientists have assumed that the universe had existed eternally. It was always there, and it always will be. Right? However, discoveries during the 20th century have proved that the universe does seem to have a beginning. Some of these are the expansion of the universe, Einstein's theories of relativity, cosmic microwave background radiation, a lot of fun stuff in there. So instead of taking a nap, you can go and look up and watch YouTube videos on what all of those are, and then we can talk about it some more. Right? But if we accept those conclusions of modern cosmology that are based on math and physics, things that we think we can trust, right, then the universe can be traced back to a very early moment that is called the Planck epoch. And it lasted about 10 to the minus 43rd seconds. So take a second and divide it into a trillion parts and then into a trillion parts, and then you're almost there. Right? So it's a really short, brief period of time. And why this is important is that as we trace science back to this point, once we hit this point as we look backwards, our current laws of physics and our understanding of how things happen cannot explain what happens in that 0 to 10 to the minus 43rd second, right? They reach their limits, right? It's not that they fail, but we can't adequately describe the conditions of what was going on, right? So in other words, science can describe what happened after that point, but it can't describe what happened before, right? Was there anything there? So this isn't proof of creation, but it marks the boundary of our scientific understanding and reinforces the idea that there was a beginning to the universe. And if we move into a more philosophical mindset, right, if the universe, which is space and time and matter and energy, if all of that had a beginning, then this argument tells us it had to have a cause. Something had to put it into place. Something had to make it happen. It had to have a creator. And if we take that argument a little bit further, its creator cannot be part of the physical universe. The creator can't be space and time and matter and energy. Why? Because those things came into existence when the universe was created. They did not exist before. The God of the Bible is described as eternal, timeless, transcendent, all-powerful, all-knowing, and distinct from his creation. He's not part of the universe. He's its creator. If the universe truly had a beginning, and if every beginning requires an adequate cause, then if we read Genesis 1:1 and 2, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. The earth was formless and empty. Darkness covered the surface of the watery depths, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the surface of the waters. This can read very differently if we look at it through that scientific lens. The Hebrew phrase, heavens and earth, is a literary expression called a merism, right? It's one of those things that I don't like because it makes me infer some things, right? But this is when two opposite extremes are used together to describe the whole. It's kind of like saying, I lost my keys, I searched high and low for them. I looked everywhere for them, right? Moses, although I wish he was not writing a modern scientific textbook, but his words communicate something remarkably comprehensive. God created everything that exists. We might summarize this verse in today's language as, in the beginning, God created the universe. And for me, this was important. While we are not told when the beginning was, the Bible teaches that there is a beginning. Science points to a beginning. Philosophy demands a creator that is independent of the creation. God matches that description. And for me, that was very satisfying. That answered, without answering, a lot of the questions that I was having. The second area that we're going to look at is biology. Where did life come from? And there are lots of theories about this out there. Just like with the creation, there are lots of rabbit holes that you can go down, right? But regardless of which theory you are looking at, each offers possible mechanisms for the chemical process, but none of them have yet demonstrated how non-living matter became the first living information-rich cell. But if we look at some modern science and that we understand and know and believe, let's see where that might be pointing us, right? So DNA is a large molecule. We've all learned it in freshman biology class. DNA is a molecule that carries the genetic information that makes you who you are. It's present in the cells in your body, and it contains the instructions for making proteins that allow your body to function. Now, when I hear instructions, I think of words that someone else came up with that are designed to guide a process. Back in the spring, Aaron and I helped assemble some of the basketball goals for the Youth Camp fundraiser. You're welcome. When we cut open the box, at the very top, there were instructions. And I'm very glad that those instructions were there, because trying to do that with a 15-year-old boy without instructions would have been a challenge, right? But Aaron took the instructions, he led the way. We had a step-by-step process that someone else had written down that told us how all of those weird-looking pieces went together and ultimately produced a basketball goal. The notion that DNA is instructions seems to imply that someone had to come up with them. Dr. Francis Collins, the scientist who oversaw the Human Genome Project, actually describes DNA, and he wrote a book about it, describes DNA as the language of God. And when he described it that way, that really kind of resonated with me. And I want to read you something, right? I told you that we would get to some scripture, and here it comes. All right, so I'm going to read you something, and as we read this, listen to what is repeated over and over in these verses, right, and how they're laid out, right? And they're all from Genesis chapter 1. So in verse 3, God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. In verse 6 and 7, God said, "Let there be an expanse between the waters, separating water from water." So God made the expanse and separated the water under the expanse from the water above the expanse. In verse 9, then God said, "Let the water under the sky be gathered in one place, and let the dry land appear." And it was so. Verse 11, then God said, "Let the earth produce vegetation, seed-bearing plants, and fruit trees on the earth, bearing fruit with seed in it according to their kinds." And it was so. Beginning in verse 14, then God said, "Let there be lights in the expanse of the sky to separate the day from the night. They will serve as signs for festivals and for the days and years. They will be lights in the expanse of the sky to provide light on the earth." And it was so. God made the two great lights. In verse 20, then God said, "Let the water swarm with living creatures, and let the birds fly above the earth and across the expanse of the sky." So God created the large sea creatures and every living creature that moves and swarms within the water according to their kinds. He also created every winged bird according to its kind. In verse 24, then God said, "Let the earth produce living creatures according to their kinds, livestock, creatures that crawl, and the wildlife of the earth according to their kinds." And it was so. So God made the wildlife of the earth according to their kinds, the livestock according to their kinds, and creatures that crawl on the ground according to their kinds. And then in 26, he gets to us. Then God said, "Let us make man in our image, after our likeness." So God created man in his own image. He created him in the image of God. He created them male and female. When I read this, there are two things that stand out. Every section begins with, then God said. And then every section has God made. Right? I read these as instructions. God is speaking and then guiding the creation process. Now, some may say, well, if those are instructions, where are the details? That would answer all of the questions that you had at the beginning. Well, whenever we give an account like this, right, I'm going to go back to the basketball goal story. If I'm giving you an account of what happened and how Aaron and I put together that basketball goal, I'm not going to tell you we took the 11 millimeter bolt H and used it to connect pole F to bracket E, and then we secured it with locking nut G. That's not going to tell you a whole lot. Instead, you're going to get something like this. Aaron and I attached the hoop to the backboard and put the net on the hoop. We attached the backboard to the pole, and then we set the pole in the base and secured it into place. Maybe Genesis 1 is this type of an account. All we care about with the basketball goal is that it was put together in the right way, and it became something that we can enjoy. And if we read Genesis that way, it sets a lot better with me. There are fewer questions that I have to answer. Everything from the universe and light all the way down to you consists of detailed instructions that can't be duplicated by any other means. Not in my science lab, not in a science lab at Oak Ridge, not in a factory in China. It's special. It's different. Now, some may argue that after billions of years, things could have all happened by random chance. At some point, Aaron and I could have successfully guessed how to put that basketball goal together. Maybe if we took the box and shook it just right, all of the pieces would have magically aligned and out would have popped a basketball goal. At some point in the past, the molecules and the physical forces could have aligned just the right way to make things as they are now. And you'll find a lot of people that will argue that point. Many believe that these extremely improbable odds and things like this can happen, and who am I to say that they can't? But consider this, right? One scientist has calculated that the odds of all of the proteins necessary for life to exist, the odds of those randomly forming are about 1 in 10 raised to the 40,000th power. Right? Now, if you're not math-minded, that is a 1 followed by 40,000 zeros. Right? That's a huge number. Right? To help give you some perspective, because I certainly needed it, right? I tried to put all of that on one of the slides, but I found out that I quickly lost count of where I was with the zeros, right? So let's think about a million and a billion, two numbers that we use all the time, right? We say things like, I never would have gotten that if you had given me a million guesses, right? Do we really understand how big that number is? Right? So let's think of a million in terms of days and seconds, right? If I ask you how many days are in 1 million seconds, any ideas? 11 days, right? And you might have my notes somewhere. There are 11, right? It's 11.6 days in a million seconds, right? So we've all been alive a million seconds, right? But can you imagine in 11.6 days trying to reach in and grab out one specific second? It'd be pretty improbable odds, right? What about a billion, right? How many days are in a billion seconds? Well, that number's a little bit bigger. There are 11,574 days in a billion seconds, right? 31.7 years. Some of us haven't been alive a billion seconds, right? And if we try to imagine reaching in and grabbing 1 second out of that, those odds are even more incomprehensibly small. Right? But it's very easy to miss the point in these numbers. These numbers should not make you feel lucky or that you're here by chance. These numbers should indicate that there is something bigger and wiser and smarter and stronger at work here. Something that is thoughtful and caring and loving did all of this. God had a plan in how he wanted to do things, and that's just what he did. You may not understand it, but you're a part of it. But why? Why aren't we a part of it? Why did the Artemis commander feel so much emotion when he saw the earth come into view as he came around the moon? Why did the power and the beauty of the ocean in Hawaii have such an impact on me? Why did I have to get out there and experience it? Why don't we feel God in those times? Right? Obviously, that's a deep and personal answer. God is eternal and all-powerful and completely self-sufficient. Right? He didn't create us because he was lonely. He didn't create us because he was incomplete. He didn't create us because he needs us. Creation was not an act of necessity, but it was one of desire. It was an expression of his love and goodness, a decision to bring into existence creatures who could know him and share in his glory. Right? John Piper often emphasizes that the ultimate purpose of creation is the glory of God. Right? He answers this, that when you ask why, the answer is God. Right? To all of this. Why? God. Right? God declares in Isaiah 43, 6 and 7, bring my sons from far away and my daughters from the ends of the earth, everyone called by my name and created for my glory. I have formed him. Indeed, I have made him. And then Paul writes in Colossians, for everything was created by him in heaven and on earth, the visible and the invisible, whether thrones or dominions or rulers or authorities. All things have been created through him and for him. The universe exists, we exist as humans to display the greatness of its creator. When we hear that we were created to glorify God, we have to be careful to understand what that really means. Glorifying God is not like polishing a piece of silver or restoring beauty to something that looks old and dingy. God can't become more glorious than he already is. But we can magnify him. We can acknowledge his supreme greatness and reflect his characters as images that were created in him. In my science lab, there are two things that magnify things. We have a microscope that makes tiny things appear larger than they seem. Right? We use this to look at bacteria and cells. And then there's a telescope. A telescope allows us to see something that is unimaginably vast, more like it truly is. And that's what our lives are meant to be. Our lives are meant to function like telescopes, helping others see the greatness and beauty and wisdom and love of God more clearly. We do not increase his glory when we do this. We display it in how we live and in what we do. The Westminster Shorter Catechism, right, is a summary of Christian doctrine that was written back in 1647. It consists of 107 principles in question and answer format. And the very first question asks, what is the chief end of man? And the answer is, man's chief end is to glorify God. We've already talked about that. But this goes one step further. And to enjoy him forever. When I read that, I had to ponder, what does it mean to enjoy God? But these two purposes belong together. The more clearly we see God's greatness, the more deeply we delight in him, and the more our lives will point others to him. Our ultimate delight, our ultimate satisfaction, our ultimate happiness should be in God, not the things of this world. So this morning, we didn't arrive at an answer that's going to silence the skeptic forever. I hope you had some fun talking through those things, right? But it's not going to silence them forever, and it's certainly not always going to make them convert and believe. We didn't figure out if the days in Genesis are 24-hour periods or if they're something else. We didn't figure out if the age of the universe is 6,000 years old or billions of years old. But after reflecting on this and considering our purpose in life to glorify God and to enjoy him forever, here's what I do believe. Do I believe that science, as we know it, points to the universe having a definite beginning and a creator? Yes, I do. And I believe that God is the creator of the universe, even though I can't go into the lab and prove it. And that those two things are well supported by Genesis chapter 1. There is a beginning, and God was in charge of that beginning. Here's what I don't know. I don't have a clue how he did it. The Bible doesn't tell us. Why doesn't the Bible tell us? Why doesn't it give a clearer description of creation? Why doesn't it read like the introduction to one of my favorite TV shows ever, where it says, our whole universe was in a hot, dense state. Then 14 billion years ago, expansion started. Wait. We're going to wait for about 10 billion years, right? The earth began to cool, the autotrophs began to drool, right? That says a lot. There's a lot in there. Why didn't God explain the dinosaurs to the writer, or at least have him add a footnote that tells us what day really means in context? I think it's because the how doesn't matter all that much. How is not the point. Maybe it's meant to be a mystery. After all, if we read Hebrews 11:3, this sounds pretty magical and a little bit like the cartoon that we saw earlier. By faith, we understand that the universe was created by God's command, so that what is seen has been made from things that are not visible. When we can accept that and realize that our two purposes are to glorify God and to enjoy him together, what it means to be human from a creation standpoint begins to make a lot of sense. Our focus and attention should be on the who and not the how. We should marvel in the fact that there is a God that created a universe where we could live and then created us so that we could know and enjoy him. We might not know the how, but we know the who and we know the why. And that just has to be enough. God, I thank you for the opportunity to talk today. I hope that as we go through life and explore what it means to be human,